Simplicity. It may seem like a pretty novel concept, having simplicity baked into your product, but I think a lot of people lose this as their guiding star on the way to the top. There's an article here from Sean Godecki, and he talks about how doing the simplest thing that could possibly work. And he really views this as a mindset. I think when we first start our projects, they're pretty new. It's very easy to stay simple in the beginning. But then as you build more and more onto it, very quickly you kind of lose sight of simplicity. We'll search something like GIMP. You're the user and you're like, hey, I just want to draw. And you're met with this UI that has freaking buttons on buttons on buttons for your buttons. This can often be a hindrance to the user. And that's really the issue of scope creep. Scope creep is something that I think everyone faces at some point in their project. If we assume GIMP is a product for artists, this is fine. This works great. But if we view GIMP as a product for a regular person, this is way too much. There's just too much going on. And I kind of looked into the history of GIMP and really what their motivations were. And it says here, GIMP had a lot of neat stuff attached to its first public release. And so this is back in 1996. Had some basic tools to do drawing, channel operations, undo feature, all this stuff. One quote that I really like in regards to GIMP is this one here, where it says, the way I would put it is GIMP has features and not workflow. Hey, dude, it's free and it's nice and all that, but dude, it's too much going on. Appreciate GIMP, don't get me wrong, right? I put GIMP up there with, WinRAR, uTorrent programs where it's like, dude, these were the staples. I do believe there's a reason why people pay for things like Photoshop and these other programs. GIMP is free and it really offers a lot of what Photoshop does. It's not as simple as using Photoshop. He talks about real mastery often involves learning when to do less, not more. The fight between an ambitious novice and an old master is a well-worn cliche in martial arts movies. The novice is a blur of motion, flipping and spinning, while the master is mostly still. Right, I just mentioned WinRAR. Have you ever had an issue with WinRAR? Like, it just works, dude. You never have to complain. Like, I don't think I've ever ran into an issue with WinRAR. Could have ended up in a feature creep situation. Somebody could have said, hey, let's add cloud functionality. Let's add plugins or app integrations. Somebody could have came to WinRAR and said, hey, let's add these things. And they would have done it, and they would have ended up with a bunch of freaking mess, right? They would have ended up just like GIMP. Let's take a look at what GIMP looked like back. It was way better, right? If I'm looking at these two comparatively, this one looks more simple. I can see something about this just feels more approachable. Whereas I'm looking at this and I'm seeing like a million different freaking options here. Now maybe this isn't the default view of GIMP and I'm looking at something that's something else. But really I'm just highlighting how a lot of the times these software, they start off one way and then they just add on to it and add on to it. And you end up with a massive freaking program. Google's, trust me bro result, it claims that the 1996 version was about 100K lines. And now we're at over 700K lines. And you have to ask yourself, has GIMP become 7 times better as a result of these additions? As with everything, there is trade-offs. There is risks about scalability when it comes to simplicity. If you're not adding in some prevention measures for future code, there's certainly some sacrificing that you can do with scalability when it comes to that. And there's also the interpretation of simple. Because the thing is, right, if somebody, maybe they've been doing web development their entire life, for them, simple is different from somebody who just got started. And so interpretation of simple definitely changes. I'm sure there's somebody that's seeing me talk about GIMP and how complicated it is and are saying, hey, you're an idiot. Because I've used GIMP 40 years and I know exactly where everything is. And he goes on to define simplicity. I encourage you to read this article because it's really, really good. But I will give my own interpretation of it. And so what is simplicity? Boils down to achieving the goal with as little as possible. And this will vary depending on what you're working on. If you're working on something really complex, obviously there's gonna be some heavy amount into it. But like in the case of GIMP, did we really need every feature that we're seeing here? Could we have maybe put some of these behind a flag or something, right? There's so much going on in one place. And so if the goal of GIMP was drawing, there's a lot of stuff here that doesn't necessarily directly tie to drawing and doesn't need to be at the forefront, right? How many of these tools here are actually directly applicable to drawing? And how many of these are nice to haves that are, maybe applicable to one specific scenario? I bet if you looked at the workflow of the average person, they're only selecting maybe 3 to 4 of these tools. And then the rest are kind of just rare one-off cases. And to the designer, they might think, oh, what's the big deal? They might think, oh, well, if they don't want to use it, just don't use the feature then, right? This is the problem I see a lot of people running into, where they assume their users can just don't use it. Well, this statement is true for somebody who's used GIMP their whole life. If I'm a new user to your product, I don't have the history of how this app works. And so when I come on here and I see a million different things, I'm confused already. And so while it's true, yeah, you just don't need to use it, right? There's certain buttons here I don't ever need to click. That's true, but it adds to my confusion. It just does. I have to think about, okay, which one does the drawing part? To me, this is against the idea of simplicity. Really, when you're designing a program, you need to view everything that you add as this, right? You're adding to this pool of Legos that you're stepping on. And so the less Legos you're stepping on, you're going to step on some Legos, don't get me wrong. But this mindset here prevents you from ending up in a scenario where you have something so complicated that people are willing to spend, how much is Photoshop? $15 a month. People will spend less just so they don't have to be confused, right? I'm sure you remember music piracy. I remember going on LimeWire. You might have just went on, the Pirate Bay. We did this in a time period where it was actually kind of annoying to get music, right? If you wanted to buy music back in the day, you pretty much had to go to iTunes, which required you to, actually submit a purchase. You could buy physical, but then it's like you have to convert it to a file. And so really, iTunes was the only really good option here. And they had other places where you could buy digital copies. But the point is, right, there was a barrier here. But then streaming came along, and now the barrier is gone. Before it felt like, buying music in the past, it was like a 10-step process, right? You had to log into iTunes, you had to search for it, you had to click purchase, you had to fill in your credit card information, and there was like weight to it. It felt like a task. Music piracy was so popular partially because it was pretty much the same, if not quicker to do. You didn't need to whip out your credit card. And really the amount of clicks that you made was pretty much the same as what you were spending over here. But now that streaming's around, dude, it's so simple. You pay one subscription fee, often like 20 a month or whatever. I think YouTube Premium's, what does YouTube Premium cost these days? That's what I use for my music these days, but 16 a month, right? 16 a month. That gives you basically a two-step operation. Search the song, play the song. Compare these operations. Pre-streaming, you had to search the song, click purchase, fill in your credit card, which oftentimes wasn't auto-filled. And then you had to download the song too. Obviously with streaming, you're technically downloading it, but it's a lot less weighted. Streaming, typically you're just downloading it on the fly, whereas downloads, it's like you had to sit there and wait until that file was completed before you can even start. And so basically we went from, a 4-step operation down to 2. And that's why today, a lot of people don't even pirate music anymore because there's more steps involved. Actually more steps to download something illegally than there is to just stream it online. And so in the case of GIMP, people are willing to pay this amount just because it's that much simpler for them. There's this article here called The Bread Paradox, Why Convenience Always Wins and Why SaaS Isn't Doomed. Pretty new article from Ja Westenberg, and it has some really interesting points about how the trend today is that SaaS is over with, but in reality, there's some element of simplicity and convenience that gives you a chance even today. And he compares it to bread. White bread, a lot of people hate white bread. I love white bread. It's so simple. And he goes on to talk about how, the ingredients are simple, right? A bag of flour costs $2 or $3 and yields maybe 10 loaves. A jar of yeast lasts for months. Salt is cheap enough to be negligible at the cost. Everything leads up to, hey, why don't we just make the bread? And the machine even does everything for you. But here's the part, right? It takes 3 hours. He mentions how he's barely used this machine to make bread because you could just go down to the grocery store and buy it right then and there. It's not even that expensive. And so this is what he's coining as the bread paradox. And he goes on to compare SaaS to bread. He talks about how AI tools have pretty much effectively made programming free. Obviously, that's not true. He does say the code is cheap. Sorry, he says the code is cheap. Even then you could argue. But anyway. And so he kind of harps on the argument of why not just build it ourselves? This is a common argument you see going around, especially with SaaS. When you can just build your own solution, why should I pay you to do it for me? The company pays for Notion, Jira, or Basecamp, or any of these tools. They're paying for thousands of engineers, compliance officers, security auditors, and domain experts that have built and refined over years, sometimes decades. They're paying for the institutional knowledge in the code base, the integration ecosystem, the regulatory certifications, and the support infrastructure, right? They're paying for a lot more than just the surface level functions. Probably a million apps out there. Think about how many note-taking apps and freaking OneDrive type apps we have, right? We have so many of these, and you literally could whip this up in a day. But what you cannot do is have the underlying infrastructure to support that product. And so the question is, how does he compare this to bread? Well, he says that a company decides to build its own version using AI coding tools is buying a bread machine. How he discussed earlier, where it's like, dude, I have a bread machine. I could use it if I want, but I just choose not to because it's just so damn convenient to go and buy the bread. The same case is here for software. Yes, we could code our own SaaS, but when there's a company that's already done it and it's right at our fingertips and we just press a button, typically they'd rather have that. And so let's go a little bit deeper on this argument here. and the importance of convenience. Now, in the case of SaaS, right, your argument might be, why don't I just build it myself? And I see a lot of people actually getting this kind of wrong when they talk about SaaS. They say, oh, big companies, why are they going to pay? They're just going to build their own solution, right? Why pay for Notion when Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all these companies could just build it internally? These companies, they have, thousands and thousands of engineers. Why don't they just pay to make it themselves? But again, as this article was talking about, right, what they're paying for is not just the product. They're paying for a lot more than that. They're paying for convenience. If the internally built SaaS has an issue, they have to literally take away work from somewhere else to fix it, right? You might have a team dedicated to this internal app, sure. But even then, you could argue they could have been allocated somewhere else, right? You're paying somebody effectively to maintain this app, and that's assuming they're dedicated to it. If they're not dedicated to it, you're paying them 100 to 200K a year, and you're taking away from somewhere else. If with an externally built SaaS, if there's an issue, it's on them, right? This is part of what you're paying for in their subscription services. You're paying for the fact that, hey, if there's a problem, we're going to work on it. We're going to fix it. We're going to, work with you and try to get it resolved. And so this is a major, major thing, this convenience part. And so I'm of the opinion, actually, I think the ones that are going to build internally, because I do believe you're going to see more internally built applications. I believe small companies are going to do this more often than big companies. And the reason I say that is because they're limited by resources, and more specifically, money. If a small company has a certain amount of money and they're paying engineers, typically small companies, they have a certain small scope and they don't need like a bajillion engineers. And so let's say a small company has 10 people, those people are allocated accurately. So it makes more sense for the small company to build their own version because of this fact. But when you have $1 bajillion, why not just pay for the convenience? Kind of going back to what I was saying about the music, I'm willing to pay extra if I have it so I can get it right away and I don't have to wait on it. Small companies aren't afforded that all the time, right? If you're a solo founder, you may not have $1 bajillion floating around, so it kind of makes sense for you to do this. But if you're not limited by money, you might as well just pay for the convenience. Pay up front, get it done, and then they take control of over all the problems. And so kind of tying in this article here, which is more focused on the engineering portion, into this article here that's more focused on the convenience user perspective, I believe we can find kind of an engineering convenience of stick to the trend of SaaS. If you build a code base haphazardly, if you're thinking about short-term convenience, which a lot of people do, especially in the day of AI, where it's like they're not thinking about tomorrow. They're just prompting day by day. And oftentimes that results in them getting bogged down in the future. If this is your point of view as a coder, you're going to end up in a really bad position later. Because if you take the short-term convenience path, you're losing agility. Your agility is going to go down because you skimped so much early on that now when you want to add new features or adapt to the market, it's a lot more involved. Whereas if you went for long-term convenience, thinking about the future, you do lose some time, right? It takes more time to be focused on long-term convenience. But if you asked me which I'd rather have, time or agility, I'll take agility every single day. Why? Because if I had 10 hours on a day when it didn't matter, it didn't matter. If I had 1 hour on a day that mattered and I was able to pivot quickly, we end up with a much better position. But so this long-term convenience that I talk about here, this comes from viewing simplicity at every step of the way. From the very start, you're introducing feature A. You're thinking about simplicity. You introduce feature B. You're thinking about simplicity. And it goes on and on and on until you are here where you're on freaking feature Z and you thought about simplicity every step of the way. And so because you're getting this additional agility that's afforded to you by being in this position, guess what? When somebody says, hey, feature B is no longer a fit for the market. Let's say with GIMP, people decided they don't want to draw anymore. They want to lick their screen. Guess what? If you took the short-term convenience path every step of the way, it's going to take you you're not going to be able to come back here. You're just not. It would take you rewriting the entire code base. But if you took convenience every step of the way, going back to feature B and making these changes, right, introducing the screen licking feature, this is actually a possibility. You don't need to sacrifice everything. And so while you do lose some time, like we were talking about, right, you do lose some time in the beginning focusing on long-term convenience. Over time, especially as reality hits in, which, the market changes all the time, you're going to end up gaining time because of the fact that when you adjust, it's a much quicker operation. And so kind of to this article's point about how, we still We still buy bread at the store pre-made because it's just so convenient. And how big companies, really, they'll still purchase these major corporation apps because of convenience. Ideally, you're hitting the convenience, and then you're also on top of that a fit for them, right? Part of convenience is simplicity. How do you achieve simplicity? As I said before, achieving the goal with as little as possible. And so if somebody came to you and said, hey, I just want to draw on my screen. I don't care about anything else. I just want to draw on my screen. Yes, GIMP can do that for you. Absolutely. But it also does a bunch of other shit, and it's going to confuse you. You're going to be lost in the sauce. And so in many cases, you'll have it to where a certain product does everything you need, but because the other company, like let's say company A, does everything you need and more, and then company B does just what you need, there's a good chance this value could be worth it. Think about the onboarding time of something like GIMP versus something like Excalidraw. Excalidraw is basically just a straight shot drawing program, whereas GIMP is a full-fledged artist program. But so if somebody came to you and said, hey, I want to be able to make full-on art, maybe, yeah, you would go to GIMP. But if you were just interested in the drawing action itself, you may purchase something just because all it does is that one specific thing. And so there really is value in doing one thing. Part of convenience is simplicity. And so in the realm of SaaS, right, you have a lot of opportunity where, yes, there are already a bajillion of these apps, but there's always some company out there, dude, where it's like they have one specific thing that they want it to do, and they don't need all this complicated BS. One interesting case study of this is a company called Resend. Resend is a pretty new company considering what they do. And if you're not familiar with Resend, they're basically a email automatic send out system. Right here, I'll go to their about page. Building the modern email sending platform. The web's come a long way in the last 10 years, but why is email stuck in the past? Effectively, what they do is they send out automatic emails for companies, right? But really all they focus on is the email part, right? They've kept their product very simple, and they came up at not that long ago. Started off in 2022. Dude, there was plenty of products that were already out at this point when it came to email. They even mentioned Boo and I were using multiple email tools, but they all felt outdated, slow, and built for marketers, not developers, right? So this was their entry point. By realizing that developers don't know how to use all this marketing BS, and they don't want to, right? They want something that's more simple and curated directly for what they're trying to do. And so this is a direct example of convenience and simplicity here. And it shows that companies can do this today and actually come out on top just by doing that. Resend ended up raising $18 million in their Series A back in 2024, and they are still a very prominent company. And so really the takeaway here is that every step of the way, you should be thinking of simplicity. Do not end up in a GIMP situation where you have a bajillion freaking buttons and options and features that most are not going to care about. Achieve the goal with as little as possible. And you have to focus on this every single step of the way. You'll be more agile. People will use you over convenience. These are underrated points that a lot of people miss up on.